Hello, can anyone hear me? Major Tom to ground control. Is everyone there?
Yes,
I can't. Okay, cool. Yeah, I had a bit of a disaster. All of the electricity is gone, and it went in the middle of my class this morning, and so I had to run out after my previous class and go to a cafe and stick my laptop on charge. So just give me. Hold on, I sent myself. Yeah, so I'm a little bit confused. And also, it's going to start getting dark in here, and I may not be able to read. Yeah, let me. Just give me a minute. Yeah, so in order to have enough charge for the whole class, I spent the last hour in a cafe and I forgot to take everything with me. And I now need to put. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about today. So I think I've got this. So this isn't the computer I normally use. Yes. Oh. Okay, so see if I can get this to work. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is I want to finish off talking about identity theory. And then if we've got time, we're going to start talking about functionalism. And so identity theory, for kind of those philosophers who saw philosophy as sort of continuous with the sciences and were motivated by a sort of respect for the sciences. After the war, there was a tendency for them to be, in some sense, physicalists or naturalists. And in the 50s and 60s, the kind of dominant view was this sort of identity theory. We're going to talk, we're going to talk about a little bit more about that. And then this was sort of replaced very quickly, I think, in the late 70s or in the 60s and 70s by the sort of view known as functionalism. And one of the things I want to kind of get across is how functionalism isn't a version of the identity theory. Yeah, and so functional properties are not the same as identity properties. So I think one of the things about functionalism is that functionalists tend to be non-reductive materialists. So that these functional properties are realized by physical things, but there's a separate class of higher level functional properties that can't be translated into or cashed out in terms of non-functional properties. And this is a view that the main sort of motivation for this, I think the most important sort of philosophical reason for the move to functionalism and the rejection of identity theory had to do with the idea that functional properties are multiply realizable. So when we look at Putnam tomorrow, the paper in Putnam has 4 sections. I think it's 4. And in the penultimate section, I think it's the 3rd section, he compares his position to identity theory. So he compares his position to identity theory and to behaviorism. And the argument in section 3 has got to do with this criticism that mental states are multiply realizable in the way that functional states are, and in the way that the identity theory rejects. Yeah, so the main objection to the identity theory that was historically the most important was this objection about multiple realizability. So I'm not going to talk about that much today, but that's one thing I hope everyone gets tomorrow. When I don't know how much you've read, that I'm going to focus on talking about the Putnam tomorrow, and then on next Tuesday I'll talk about the discussion by David Marr, where he's very influential account of these 3 levels of description, which is central. In terms of the chapter by Heil, if I have time tomorrow, he has a little discussion in the middle about functional properties, and I've got the wrong version of the text here, but he has this discussion of being of the way in which being a vice president or a deputy CEO is a functional property. And if I have time, I might look at that passage in Heil. Yeah, so for tomorrow we're going to look at Putnam, and I want you to read the Putnam. He talks about a Turing machine. I think all the details in the Putnam for tomorrow, the details of how a Turing machine works isn't particularly important for the argument. So he has a chapter where he has a section where he introduces his idea that these states are functional states, computational states, and he appeals to a Turing machine. I think the details of Turing machines aren't particularly important to understand it. So I'm just telling you what we're going to do tomorrow to give you an idea of what to focus on for the reading tomorrow. Okay, so last time we looked at Smart, and Smart has this idea. Smart has this idea that he starts off by talking about behaviorism. Yeah, so he characterizes the behaviorist view as one according to which mental states are best thought of as something like a temptation. Yeah, so he makes this distinction between this idea about whether mental state terms are reporting expressions, whether they're referential, and the behaviorist rejects the idea that mental state terminology is reporting. When I tell you that I'm in pain, I'm not giving a description. I'm not reporting about what is the case. I'm doing something else. And so the way he characterizes the behaviorism is that mental states are best thought of in terms of something like a temptation. Yeah, so when I say that I'm seeing this after image, I'm expressing some sort of temptation. And what sort of temptation? A linguistic temptation, a temptation to say something, the temptation to say that there is a roundish yellowy orange patch on the wall. Yeah, and so we're to understand mental states. This is the behaviorist view. The identity theory, in contrast, this is on page 62. So this is where he gives his kind of characteristic account of the identity theory. So he says, let me try to state more accurately the thesis that sensations are brain processes. Yeah. So the first thing is that it's important for him that this is not a claim about meaning. So for the behaviorists, I think, we're coming out of this logical positivist idea, coming out of this idea that, we're doing analytic philosophy, and analytic philosophy involves the analysis of concepts. And all you really get in philosophy is conceptual analysis. Yeah, so there was a kind of sort of tendency, I think, in the 40s and 50s to think that when a philosopher told you A is B, what they were offering you was something like a definition or some sort of conceptual analysis. So I think it's very important for both for Smart and for the functionalists, that they're not attempting to offer conceptual analysis. Yeah, what they're doing, they're not offering an account of the meaning of the terms involved. Yeah, they're not offering an account of what pain means. They're offering an account of what pain is. And in order to do this, they're basically drawing on the kind of Frege-Russell account of the the Fregean account of the sense reference distinction. So when you've got a concept, you've got its meaning and you've got its reference. And according to Frege, when you say that two things are the same, when you say A is B, the morning star is the evening star, Superman is Clark Kent, basically you're not giving an analysis of the terms used, but what you're saying is the two terms or the two concepts, however you want to cash it out, are co-referential. Yeah. So the sort of identity theory is positing is the idea that we've got these two different uses of language. We've got these two different ways of using language that we can use to refer to the same thing. So just as the terms Clark Kent and Superman refer to the same individual, the expressions I am in pain and Lucas's C fibers are firing refer to the same thing. Yeah, so what the claim is a claim about co-referentiality. Yeah, so he says, let me try and state more accurately the thesis that sensations are brain processes. It is not the thesis that, for example, after image and ache mean the same as brain process of sort X, where X is replaced by a description of a certain sort of brain process. Yeah, so we're not making a claim about conceptual analysis. We're not saying that what someone means when they say they're in pain is that their C fibers are firing. Yeah, that it is that insofar as after image or ache is a report of a process, it is a report of a process that happens to be a brain process. Yeah, so I take it that we've got these two bits of language. We have language that talks about brain processes and language that talks about pains. Yeah, and this language of brain processes uses the vocabulary maybe of neuroscience. This is sort of the smart idea. And that the objective, the language that we use to refer to our own mental states picks out something that is also picked out by this other language. Yeah. So I think one thing that's important about this claim then is that it follows that the thesis does not claim that sensation statements can be translated into statements about brain processes. So I take it if you've got two expressions that have the same meaning, the idea is that you've got some sort of co-translatability. Whenever you've got a sentence with one term in, you can put the other term in without loss of meaning. And I take it that this is something that doesn't follow. So we've got two different uses of language, two different sets of concepts, mentalistic concepts and physical brain concepts. And the idea is that these two bits of language pick out the same things. Yeah. So and so it does not claim that the logic of sensation statements is the same as that of brain process statements. Yeah. All it claims is that insofar as sensation statement is a report of something, that something is in fact a brain process. So that something, the mental state, is something that is picked out by this use of neurological language. It's picked out by the use of the sort of language we use in neuroscience. Now, here he gets it, puts it again. Sensations are nothing over and above brain processes. And, you know, nations, he says, are nothing over and above citizens. But this does not prevent the logic of nation statements being quite different from the logic of citizen statements. Nor does it ensure the translatability of nation statements into citizen statements. Yeah, so he's a sort of atomist about social groups. and a country, all it is a group of individuals. According to this, we might have we might make an identity statement here that all nations are sets of individuals. That's going to be an identity claim. Now, I think that's probably not true, because I think with institutions, you have institutions. This is my kind of Hegelian sort of take on these things. Yeah, so I think nations probably are not just sets of individuals, but you might think that you might have a view that all countries are sets of individuals. Yeah, and once again, that's supposed to be an identity claim. When you talk about Turkey, all you're really talking about is a group of individuals. But that the logic of country statements and the logic of individual statements are going to be quite different. Yeah, so it's not a claim. It's not going to be a claim about meaning. It's going to be a claim about co-reference. Now, why should we accept such an identity statement? What sort of reasons do we in general have for accepting identity statements? So why should I think that what does he think? Well, why should we think that mental states are brain states? And why should we believe in this identity? Yep, Begum.
I think it was in Heil, but it's mostly about parsimony, that we don't invoke another substance, but say that there is just they are equal, basically.
Yeah, you've missed out one step of the argument. You're just basically assuming it. So I take it like the argument is there's a correlation between brain states and mental states. So let's take, now I actually think it turns out this isn't so obvious. So I think it's quite difficult to find correlations in the way that they're assuming. But let's say you find a bunch of correlations between particular types of brain states and particular types of mental state. Yeah, so you've got a particular type of brain state, and that goes together with a particular type of, say, conscious state. Yeah, so first of all, the claim is that there are these correlations. Yeah, and these correlations are discovered by scientists. So we do some empirical research, and we discover that, when I poke your brain, when I give a little charge to a bit of your brain, or that there's a particular type of mental state that's correlated with that. Now, of course, the correlation itself doesn't push you towards physicalism. Yeah, because you could be a dualist and you could say there are just these laws that connect changes in the mental to changes in the physical and vice versa. Yeah, so the fact that there's a correlation, but I take it his claim is an appeal to Occam's razor, that the simplest way to account for this correlation is in terms of an identity. Yeah, so the best explanation, or the simplest explanation for why there is this correlation is an identity. Is because mental states are brain states. That's basically the argument. Now, why? I think this argument, when you start pushing it, it's not obvious. It's not obvious to me how it's supposed to be cashed out. So there's a bunch of alternatives, but I take it the kind of main sort of Cartesian alternative is that you just have a bunch of psychophysical laws. So why can't there be psychological laws? Yeah, so why don't we explain this correlation in terms of psychophysical laws? What's Begum? Did you get what his sort of argument here? So the Cartesian says, okay, we've got this correlation, and then we've got an explanation that there are these laws that link the physical to the mental.
But then that wouldn't reduce it from 2 to 1. It would still be a dualist. It would just mean that it means, or just we would have a link between the two, but they wouldn't be equal.
Yeah,
Isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure. So I think, like, you've got the number of entities you're positing, but I take it that I take it the argument. So he has this discussion of nomological danglers, and nomological means having to do with law. And I take it, yeah, like one way of thinking about Occam's razor, a parsimony, is that you shouldn't multiply entities. Yeah. And so in some sense, you might say, well, the kind of the identity theorist has less entities because you only have bodies. And so you might think, well, it's just simpler because there are less things. Yeah. It seems to me that I mean, it's not obvious what to make of that. It seems to me that's not really the way in which Smart is really going. It seems to me that he thinks that in some sense, it's not just about the number of things, but like it's got to do with the explanatory simplicity. So once you've got this identity thesis, that you don't, so it's not just that you have to have physical stuff and mental stuff. Yep, it's that you need all these laws. So you've got all of these laws, and these psychophysical laws themselves just seem to be ad hoc and don't seem to have any explanation. It just seems to be a brute, unexplained fact that you've got all of these psychophysical laws linking the physical to the mental. So I take it that, yeah, you've got this worry about the identity theory is simpler because it posits less entities, but also it doesn't posit all of these ad hoc laws. Yep. So he says, to use Feigl, it is not often realized how odd would be the laws whereby these nomological danglers would dangle. So you end up just with a huge number of fairly ad hoc laws that don't have any real logic to them. Yeah. So I take it it's not just that you have too many entities, but you also have to posit a whole bunch of ad hoc laws, and there doesn't seem to be any obvious principle to connect to underlie why these laws are as they are. So I think kind of one of the worries that Smart has and Feigl also has is it's not just you're positing two sets of entities, but you also have to posit a whole bunch of unexplained laws. Yeah, so you end up with a set of laws with no sort of principle underlying the laws. So one thing about the laws of physics, you might think when you're doing physics, you want a set of laws that all sort of connect to each other, that have some sort of unity to them. But these psychophysical laws, it looks like it's just going to be an ad hoc mess. Yeah. So one advantage of identity theory over dualism is that it's a much simpler explanation of the correlation between the mental and the physical, because it doesn't have to posit an unsystematic ad hoc set of psychophysical laws. That's basically, I think, his main sort of reason, as far as I can understand. Now, I'm a bit skeptical of this, because it seems to me you don't have these ad hoc laws, but you just have a lot of kind of identities that, I mean, you have a bunch of identities that seem also in need of explanation. Why is it that precisely this type of physical state is this mental state? And it seems to me that you say there's just an identity, and in some sense, by claiming an identity, you're claiming there's no need for explanation. You would say, oh, we don't need to explain this because they just happen to be the same thing. But it's not obvious, like when we say heat is mean kinetic energy, that we've got an overall framework as a whole, and we can understand the way in which change, we can understand how everything fits together. But with these identities between the mental and the physical, it seems to me that the identity theorist just says these identities don't need to be explained. And that the fact that there's an identity means there's no need for explanation. But I think the opponent of the identity theorist can just say, well, these identities themselves just seem mysterious to me. And you haven't kind of in some sense discharged your need of explanation. You've just basically said you're refusing to explain. Yeah, or you can't explain. So it seems to me that the opponent of the identity theorist is just going to think that these unexplained identities are just as worrisome, as just as problematic as unexplained, unsystematic, ad hoc psychophysical laws. Atesh.
So I want to ask about the intranslatability. He talks in the previous paragraph, I guess. So as far as I can see, the identity statement itself is in some sense a linguistic statement, and the intranslatability of mental terms to physical terms, doesn't that itself entail that they are not identical?
Well, I mean, so I take it like they're looking at the history of science. So these are people both smart. This is kind of analytic philosophy was quite rooted in the philosophy of science. So they're looking at these identities within science, you know, in the scientific revolution, and then they're trying to apply this to the mental, yeah, and the physical. And I guess the sort of claim is that heat, you know, heat is mean kinetic energy, but mean kinetic energy is not translatable into heat, yeah, because in some sense you've got this, you know, you can know a lot about heat without knowing anything about mean kinetic energy. Yeah, you can perfectly well use the language of heat, and you can talk about heat without knowing anything about mean kinetic energy. Yeah, and I take it that if it was supposed to be analytic, then in some sense you wouldn't have to go off and do science to discover that heat is mean kinetic energy. You'll just have to do conceptual analysis. And there's, you know, there's nothing in the concept of heat, like the concept of, you know, you might think that in the scientific revolution we have these everyday words, yeah, and then we've got a scientific vocabulary, and then in some sense we're able to explain the objects of, you know, the objects picked out by our everyday language could also be referred to in this new systematic scientific language. Yep. So, and you know, if you ask someone what is lightning, if you ask a peasant what is lightning, they'll say it's a flash in the sky. I don't know. At some point, let's say you've got this idea that you get this flash, and you know, it's something that can be seen. Now, and you might think that, you know, I guess Smart thinks that the meaning of lightning is it's a flash that can be seen in the sky during a storm. Yeah, and now we've discovered that lightning is electrical discharge, but there's nothing in the meaning of the term lightning that has anything to do with electric discharge. The lightning, as we understand it today, so lightning as common sense understands it, is understood, I take it, in terms of things like secondary qualities. Yeah, we talk, lightning looks a certain way, yeah, heat feels a certain way. So I take it that, like, if we look at scientific change, that we've got one set of vocabulary, language about heat, language about lightning, our common sense language, our common sense everyday pre-scientific language, and the meaning of these terms, I think, for people like Smart and for Feigl, is understood in terms of, you know, you ask someone on the street, what is lightning? And they'll tell you, and they'll tell you what they mean. Yeah, and they can do that without knowing anything about electricity. Or does that help? So, I mean,
yes, it does help. But so are you meaning something like there are several linguistic frameworks like Carnap's frameworks or language games, something like that, but there is no hierarchy between those language games. I mean, pain and C fibers refer to the same thing through different
so
frameworks, basically.
I think the basic idea is you've got these different frameworks. So we might have the framework of common sense, yeah, kind of where we talk about things like lightning and heat, and the meaning these terms have in our common everyday framework is the meaning of the terms is tied to, you know, sensible qualities. Yeah, the meaning of these terms has got to do with, and of course these guys buy into this sense reference distinction. Yeah, so these guys think that when we've got a term like heat, we've got the concept of heat, yeah, we've got the meaning, and the meaning is to be understood in terms of something like a Fregean sense. Yep, and then we've got the reference. Yep, and then we've got these two different linguistic frameworks. We've got the language of common, we've got the pre-scientific language of common sense, and then we've got the kind of language of science, of our best scientific theories. And I take it that we've got these two different linguistic frameworks that we can, and there are terms in these frameworks that are co-referential. Yep, so we've got our everyday common sense language, and that our common sense term heat picks out something, refers to something that is also referred to by a bit of terminology in our regimented scientific language. Now, and then I take it that these guys are then committed to the idea that these different frameworks are not equal, but somehow the scientific framework is more basic. So the language, you know, reality is as science tells us, not as common sense tells us. Yeah, and so the language of physics refers to things as they really are. So once we've got a final, fully worked out physics, yep, and I take it their thought is that the language of neuroscience ultimately can be cashed out in terms of physics. Not obvious, but I think that they probably think something like that. But you've got these two different languages, so you've got these two different language games. I mean, if I talk about language games, that makes it sound too Wittgensteinian, and these guys are very different. I think Carnap is going to be closer, except Carnap, I think, doesn't, at least in the early Carnap in the 30s, doesn't seem to necessarily privilege particular games. Yeah, but I think you've got these different languages. We've got the language of common sense and then the language of science. And the language of science is definitely privileged. Yeah. So, and I take it that objection 1, yeah, is connected to this question. So he says an illiterate peasant can talk perfectly well about his after images or how things look or feel to him, or about his aches and pains, and yet he may not know anything about neurophysiology. Yeah, that, and I take it that this is, yeah, like one can possess the concept heat without possessing the concept energy. Yeah, this is the sort of thought. But you might think that if something is part of the meaning of something, to possess, you know, if water means H2O, you might think then to possess the concept water is going to involve possessing the concept hydrogen and oxygen. Yeah, because if you understand what water means, and so these, I think Smart has a sort of picture like this. Now, I think since then, with people like Kripke, I think many people now sort of reject the idea that we have both a sense and a reference. Yeah, that you might think with terms like water, what water means is H2O. But I think both Feigl and Smart are working within a sort of quite strongly Fregean sort of framework, according to which a term has both a sense, a meaning, and a reference, and that we can separate these two things, and that scientific discovery involves discovering that two concepts with different senses are co-referential. Yeah, so we've got two different forms of description. So like he says, he gives the example of the lightning. So he says modern physical science tells us that lightning is a certain kind of electrical discharge. Yeah. This is now believed. It is what the true nature of lightning is. So modern science provides us with an account of the true nature of things. But no, there are not two things, a flash of lightning and an electrical discharge. There is one thing, a flash of lightning. Yep. But we've got this one thing that can be described in two ways. Yep. Which is described scientifically as an electrical discharge to the earth. Yep. Or can be described, and then we have another concept. We might think that the common sense concept is also a description, but it's a description that involves some sort of things like how things look. Yeah. Yeah, and then we have this weird sort of sense data stuff. Okay, so we haven't got long left. There are two things I wanted to talk about in Smart. First of all, there's his account of secondary qualities. And then there's the discussion of where the philosophical disagreement lies. Well, yeah, so let's go to the end first, because I think this is sort of useful. So when we make the claim that mental processes are brain processes, I think he thinks that in making this claim, there's a sort of empirical side and there's a philosophical side. So when we say that mental processes are brain processes, types of mental process are identified with types of brain process. He thinks that there's a sort of philosophical side to this claim, and there's an empirical side to this claim, and then there's a non-empirical part of the claim. So this is on the final page. Well, who read this and think they could explain how he gets this division of labor between the sort of philosophical side of the claim and the empirical side? So he compares himself to the position of Place. So Place says that this identity theory, this commitment to physicalism, is a straight out scientific hypothesis. And Smart wants to reject this. Smart wants to say, no, no, no. The claim that brain process is the mental process is not a purely philosophical claim, not a purely scientific claim. It's not a purely empirical claim. Can people remember what he says here? Anyone? So he says, Smart, Place is partly right and partly wrong. He says, if the issue is between, say, a brain process thesis and a heart thesis, or a liver thesis, or a kidney thesis, so we might think that mental processes are processes that take place in the stomach and the heart. this is something I think Aristotle suggested, that the kind of seat of the mind isn't in the brain, it's in the heart. Yeah. So I think Aristotle thought that the brain was just kept the body cool. It was sort of like a cooling mechanism for the body. So if we're kind of wanting to identify mental processes with some bodily process, and we want to know which bodily processes, that seems to be a purely empirical claim. The claim that mental processes are brain processes and not liver processes or heart processes, that's an empirical claim, and the evidence we have for this is that there's correlations between changes in the brain processes and changes in the mental processes in a way you don't find a similar correlation in terms of the kidney or the liver. So he says then the issue is a purely empirical one, and the verdict is overwhelmingly in favor of the brain. Yeah. Now I'm not sure this is so obvious. I tend to think that the whole nervous system you may think is going to be involved. It seems to me that there are certain sorts of processes that intrinsically involve the body. Thinking back to behaviorism and to Ryle, you might think that when you're doing arithmetic and you're using a pen and paper, yeah, you're sort of using the pen and paper as a sort of external memory. Yeah, and you're writing down numbers. Seems to me that doing arithmetic using a pen and paper, that this is a mental process, and it's a process that doesn't just involve the brain. Yeah, it's a process that involves moving your body. There's feedback loops. Of course, the brain does play a special sort of role, but it doesn't seem obvious to me that empirically that it's obvious that mental processes are necessarily brain processes. If you're interested in this, David Chalmers, there's a quite famous article in Analysis on the extended mind by David Chalmers and Andy Clark from about 10 years ago, called The Extended Mind, where they basically give this argument. And Andy Clark then has quite a nice book that I quite often teach from called Supersizing the Mind. Anyone read Supersizing the Mind? Anyone heard of this book? Yeah, I'll put it in the, yeah. So him and David Chalmers are into this idea that, that they're sort of functional, or David Chalmers is a functionalist, and so is Andy Clark. They're computationalists, but they think that the sort of computations that are involved in cognition don't just occur inside the head. So a lot of our cognition involves the whole body, involves the external world. And so Andy Clark's book called Supersizing the Mind has some quite interesting stuff about how certain things that we take as cognitive are sort of, a bunch of the computational tasks are offloaded to the body. Yeah, so the way your body's designed, in a certain sense, a lot of how we walk has got to do with how our body works mechanically. Yeah, and so walking is a process that there's cognitive side to it. Yeah, so if anyone's interested, yeah, so it doesn't seem obvious to me that empirically that we know that mental processes are brain processes. It depends. If you think kind of doing arithmetic is a mental process, and then you think of, yeah, most of the time when we do arithmetic, when we count and we use our fingers, yeah, when a child is counting, they move their fingers and they're looking at their fingers. If you hide their fingers, they can't count. Yeah, so the child who's counting and using their fingers, I think for us, we use some sort of internal memory, but a child in some sense, a young kid who's just learning to count is using their fingers as an external memory as they're counting. So you might think that the mental process of doing arithmetic is one that for the child involves the whole body. But Smart thinks that yeah, we've got this brain thesis, we've got the empirical claim that mental processes are brain processes as opposed to kidney processes. And this is an empirical claim, and the evidence for it has got to do with correlations. Yeah, we discover, the thought is, correlations between brain changes in brain state and changes in mental state. So he says the right sorts of things don't go on in the heart, liver, or kidney, nor do these organs possess the right sort of complexity of structure. Yeah. On the other hand, if the issue is between a brain or heart or liver or kidney thesis, that is some sort of materialism on the one hand, and epiphenomenalism on the other hand, then the issue is not an empirical one. Yeah. There's no conceivable experiment. So epiphenomenalism I talked about last class. So epiphenomenalism is a form of dualism, but basically says there's a one-way causal relationship. Mental is separate from the physical. Changes in the physical cause changes in consciousness. Yeah, but the consciousness is sort of causally inert. Yeah, that nothing that goes on in consciousness has any effect in the physical world. So consciousness is like a foam that sort of floats above the physical world. Yeah, so according to epiphenomenalism, epiphenomenalism is a form of dualism. It is a form of dualism that thinks that the consciousness is inert. It doesn't have any causal powers. So it's a form of dualism that the physicalist who's committed to the causal closure of the physical can accept. Yeah. So if you're an epiphenomenalist, you think there are mental and physical events. The mental is distinct from the physical, but there's all causation is physical causation. The only stuff that has any sort of causal power is physical stuff. Yeah, so all the laws of nature are physical laws. There's no intervention into the natural world by the mental, but the mental is floating on top of the physical. So epiphenomenalism was a kind of form of dualism that is very kind of a weak form of dualism. Yeah, that basically wants to say that the mental is non-physical, but it keeps the autonomy of the physical. Yeah, you don't have any causation from the mental to the physical. And I think Smart sees this as his main sort of enemy. And he thinks that whether or not you're an identity theorist or an epiphenomenalist, there's no scientific evidence that could convince you of one or the other. Yeah, whether epiphenomenalism is true or physicalism is true is not a scientific question, because they're both compatible with exactly the same data. They're empirically equivalent. Yeah, there's no experiment that could ever show you one of them is correct, because they're going to give you exactly the same results. So he says, for there is no conceivable experiment which could decide between materialism and epiphenomenalism. So this latter issue is not like the average straight out empirical issue in science. Yeah, but it's like the issue between the 19th century English naturalist Philip Gosse and the orthodox geologists and paleontologists on his day. So this was an argument between, certain type of scientists and then religious scientists. So the Christians were like, well, we know from the Bible that the world was created 4,000 years ago. And then the scientists are like, well, we've got evidence that the world has been inhabited by humans for millennia. Yeah, for in the evolutionary history. And these sort of Christians, like Gus, said, well, the earth was created exactly as the Bible said. Yep, but God created it with evidence to make it look like it has been there for millions of years. Yep. Now, I think the point is that scientifically, that Gus's thesis is going to give you exactly the same predictions as the evolutionary view, that the earth has existed for millennia. Yeah, so it's not the sort of thought is the argument between these two positions is not a scientific disagreement. It's not a disagreement that could be decided by evidence. Rather, it's just that Goss's view is just crazy and ad hoc. It just is, you know, yeah. So he says, you know, for Goss, the earth was created about 4000 BC, exactly as described in the Bible, with twisted rock strata, evidence of erosion and so forth, all in their appropriate strata, just as if the usual evolutionary story had been told. Now, clearly, so God created the world 4,000 years ago, but made it appear that evolution was true. So that our belief in his creation has to be a matter of faith, not a matter of science. That's why God did it. He wanted to test our faith. Yeah. So clearly, I mean, this theory is in a sense irrefutable. No evidence can ever tell against it. Yep. So, so the sort of thought is that the difference here is not one of evidence, but we've got to appeal to something else. And so he says the hypothesis offends against the principles of parsimony and simplicity. Yeah, there would be far too many brute and inexplicable facts. Yeah, so the idea, the sort of thought is that we want as few brute, inexplicable facts as possible in our theories. And you know, oops, the electricity just came back. Yes. Zubaydah is supposed to be teaching in 10 minutes. And I had to run to a cafe and charge both of our laptops. And my one's down to like 20% now. Anyway, this is the sort of worry. And I think he thinks the most plausible form of dualism is epiphenomenalism. And in some sense, he thinks all of the evidence for identity theory is also evidence for epiphenomenalism. And then I take it he thinks that the biggest advantage of this identity theory has to do with the last, yeah, so it's simpler, it's more elegant, it's got parsimony and simplicity. And in particular, the worry is that dualism involves a large number of irreducible psychophysical laws. So we have a bunch of basically brute fact laws that just seem completely arbitrary and inexplicable. Why does this particular brain thing give the experience of red, not green? Why is there a correlation? Why is there a law? And I take it that for those who are into a sort of dualism with psychophysical laws, so one person I like is Thomas Reid, and he's very explicit about this. He thinks the laws are all contingent. The laws, all of the psychophysical laws are made by God, and God could have created the world with different psychophysical laws. So the reason this type of change in the brain causes this type of conscious experience is just because God set up the world in that way. The laws, the psychophysical laws are all contingent. They're just brute. They don't have any sort of necessity or systematicity to them. And so the psychophysical laws lack systematicity. Now, I think the problem is that identity theory doesn't help, because it seems to me that we just have a bunch of brute identities. And it seems to me that, I mean, why is it that this brain state is identical to the experience of green, rather than the experience of red or the experience of yellow or the experience of something else? And it seems to me that it's not obvious to me that how this is any better. That's my sort of thought. Anyway, we didn't talk about primary and secondary qualities. I think this is a fun discussion, and it's a real difficulty for their position, how to explain. Yeah, so this is on page. This is objection. This is on page 64. So if any of you are interested, I think the discussion here is quite interesting. It's a bit fiddly. We could have spent a whole hour just on page 64, but we didn't. we just work through some other stuff. And tomorrow, it's not essential you know this, but I think it's quite interesting. If you're interested in the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of perception, then how does a physicalist offer an account of secondary qualities, like redness, and then our experience of red in the absence of a red object, the after image of red or imaginary red, I think is sort of interesting. Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow. I felt today's class was a bit of a mess just because I'm stuck on my laptop and I had to run to a cafe to charge my laptop. So hopefully I'll be a bit less kind of confused tomorrow. So I'll see you tomorrow. I've got to run because Zubaydah needs to take over. Bye-bye. How do I?